9 months, my daughter and I shared a single motel room on Route 9 in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, while my late wife's brother sat in the house I spent 31 years paying off, telling anyone who asked that I had simply lost my mind after the grief. He wasn't entirely wrong about the grief part, but the rest of it was a lie so polished it could have passed for marble. My name is Raymond Kowalski. I'm 67 years old. I spent 4 decades as a licensed electrician, built my own business from a van and a tool belt, and I thought I understood how the world worked. I thought I understood family too. I thought shared blood meant something. I was wrong about that last part in a way that cost me everything, and then on a Tuesday night in November cost my daughter something she will carry for the rest of her life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. At my wife's funeral. My wife, Lorraine, died of pancreatic cancer on October 3rd. She was 59 years old. She fought for 14 months. I was there for every single day of it, every infusion, every scan, every morning she couldn't get out of bed without help. I held her hand in the hospital at 4 a.m. when the pain was so bad she couldn't speak. I read to her from the paperback novel she loved. When the morphine made it hard for her to focus, I never left, not once. Because you don't leave, you just don't. Her brother, my brother-in-law, a man named Douglas, showed up 3 times during those 14 months. Once at Christmas, once when it looked like she might turn a corner, and once at the end when the hospice nurse called to say it was a matter of days. He stood in the doorway of her room, in a shirt that probably cost $400, and cried in the loud theatrical way of a man performing grief for an audience. After she passed, he was the one who handled the arrangements. He said it was because I was too devastated to deal with logistics. That was partially true. I was devastated. What I didn't realize was that while I was sitting with my daughter at the graveside, Douglas was already making other arrangements entirely. My daughter Ivy was 26 at the time. She had moved home 2 years earlier after finishing her nursing degree, planning to stay just long enough to help with her mother's care. She never left. She slept on a cot in Lorraine's room for the last 4 months. She was as gentle with her mother as anyone I have ever seen. The morning after the funeral, Douglas came to the house. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where my wife and I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, and he slid a manila envelope across the wood. I thought it was a sympathy card, some kind of legal document about Lorraine's estate, something I could deal with next week, next month, when I could breathe again. It was a notice of default on the mortgage. I stared at the paper. I read it 3 times. Then I looked up at Douglas. "The house has a second lien on it," he said. He sounded tired, patient, like he was explaining something to a slow child. "Lorraine took it out 4 years ago. She didn't tell you because she didn't want you to worry. The medical bills got ahead of her. The bank started the process last month." I opened my mouth. No words came. "I've spoken to the bank," he continued. "They're willing to work with me to manage the situation. But Raymond, you have to understand, the amount owed exceeds the equity. You're underwater. The most practical thing is to let me step in as the estate executor and negotiate a sale before the bank forces one." I asked him about the savings account, the one Lorraine and I had built over 30 years. The one I knew had close to $200,000 in it. He looked at me with something I can only describe as practiced sorrow. "That was used for the treatments not covered by insurance," he said. "I'm sorry, Raymond. I know this is a lot." 2 weeks later, the locks were changed. I was told I had 30 days to remove my belongings. Ivy and I packed what we could into my truck and her Honda. We left behind the dining room table Lorraine had picked out. The year we got married. We left behind the raised garden beds I built along the back fence, still full of her tomato plants, still tied to their stakes with strips of old cotton t-shirts the way she liked. We drove to the cheapest motel we could find, and we stayed there for 9 months. The room had 1 queen bed, a television that got 12 channels, and a bathroom where the grout had turned the color of old pennies. Ivy slept in the bed. I slept on the floor with a folded blanket under me because the mattress hurt my back. I told her it was fine. I told her we were just in between places. I told her it would be a few weeks. She knew I was lying. She didn't say so. I'm not going to tell you those 9 months were dignified, because they weren't. I'm a 67-year-old man who built a business with his hands, who wired half the commercial buildings in 3 counties, who coached Little League for 8 years. I sat in that motel room and applied for every electrical job within 40 miles, and I heard nothing. At 67, with stiff fingers and a back that cracked when I bent over the outlet boxes, I was invisible to every contractor who opened my resume. We ate from the gas station, 2 doors down, more nights than I want to count. Ivy picked up extra shifts at a hospital 20 miles away, working doubles when she could, and she handed me cash every Friday with the calm, careful manner of someone trying not to make you feel the weight of what they're giving you. I took it because I had no other choice. That is a particular kind of shame that doesn't have a name I know of. Douglas, meanwhile, had moved into the house. He told the neighbors he was managing the estate. He planted annuals in Lorraine's garden beds. He had someone repaint the front shutters a different color, and then came the night. Everything changed. I was sitting in the truck in the motel parking lot because Ivy was on a phone call inside, and I didn't want to be in the room with nothing to do at 11 o'clock at night. I had the heat running low because a quarter tank had to last until Thursday. I was watching the rain hit the windshield and doing the math in my head for the 1,000th time, the way you do when the math never gets any better, but you keep doing it anyway. Someone knocked on the passenger window. My first thought was motel security. We'd been asked once already to limit our length of stay, and I had smiled and nodded and said we'd be moving along soon. But the face at the window wasn't motel security. It was a woman, 50s, carrying a briefcase under an umbrella. She was dressed as she'd come from an office, not a parking lot. I cracked the window an inch. "Mr. Kowalski," she said. "Raymond Kowalski. I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. Your old address and your phone number, both disconnected. I had to hire a locator service to find you." She paused. "My name is Janet Hale. I'm a probate attorney. I think your brother-in-law has been lying to you about your wife's estate. May I come in?" I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about every scam I'd ever heard of. I thought about how much I wanted her to be telling the truth. I unlocked the door. She climbed in and shook the water off her umbrella and pulled a folder from her briefcase. She turned on the dome light without asking. Then she spread 3 documents across the dashboard like she'd done this 100 times before, because she had. "Your wife owned a property," she said. "She purchased it 17 years ago under her maiden name, a commercial unit in Doylestown, a small strip of retail space, 4 units. Fully leased. It generates approximately $9,000 per month in net rent after the management company takes its cut." I stared at the papers. "That's impossible," I said. "Lorraine would have told me." Janet looked at me the way people look at you, when the kindest thing they can do is not soften it. "She was going to tell you," she said. "There's a letter. She wrote it 2 years ago and left it with our firm." She was waiting for the right moment. She was afraid of how you'd react, knowing she'd been keeping a separate account. She wanted it to be a surprise for your retirement. She paused. She got sick before she ever had the chance. I sat there in the truck cab with rain hitting the roof and my dead wife's handwriting on a folder in my lap, and something inside me that had been braced for a long time finally just let go. I couldn't stop it. I put my face in my hands and I wept in a way I hadn't allowed myself to since the funeral. The big, ugly, gasping kind of crying that has no dignity in it whatsoever. And Janet Hale sat in the passenger seat of my truck and didn't say a word, just let me. When I was done, she handed me a paper towel from her briefcase. I don't know why she had paper towels in her briefcase, but I was grateful. "How much has he collected?" I asked. She turned to the bank statements. 9 months of transfers, $147 short of $81,000. All of it moved into an LLC Douglas had formed the week after Lorraine's funeral. I read the name of the LLC. He had named it after his consulting firm. He'd been running my wife's rental income through his own business accounts. He filed an affidavit claiming you were mentally incapacitated due to grief, Janet said. He appointed himself as the estate's informal administrator. It's not legally valid the way he structured it, but it gave him enough cover to intercept the rental payments before anyone looked too closely. I thought about the house, the locks, the 30-day notice, the story about the second lien. Was there actually a second mortgage? I asked. Janet shook her head. I closed my eyes. The house was not underwater. The savings account, I didn't know about the savings account yet, but I found out later that it was largely intact too, transferred into the same LLC the month after Lorraine passed. He had liquidated almost nothing for medical bills. He had simply taken it. He had stood at the kitchen table the morning after my wife's funeral and looked me in the eye and told me I was broke. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because I have to sit with that for a moment, because I have to sit with it every time I think about it. The morning after I buried my wife. He sat in my kitchen. He told me I had nothing. Janet Hale was still talking. There's something else, she said. There's a man who wants to meet you. His name is Gerald Harmon. She caught my expression. You know him. I did know him. Or I had known him. Once. Gerald Harmon was one of the first commercial contractors I'd ever worked for, back when I was 22 years old and new to the trade. He'd given me my first big job, a full rewire on a 4-story office building in Trenton. He was a fair man. He paid on time, and he didn't cut corners, which in construction is rarer than it sounds. I hadn't seen him in over 30 years. He's 81, Janet said. He has about 2 months. He's been following what happened to you. One of his investigators recognized the situation through some property filings. He asked us to find you. She paused. He says he remembers you. We drove out the next morning, Ivy and I, in her Honda, with the heat running all the way up because the night before had been cold and neither of us had slept. We pulled up to a house in New Hope that backed up to the Delaware, a white colonial that had been beautiful once and was still trying. A nurse let us in. She led us through a hallway lined with framed blueprints and old project photographs. Buildings I recognized from a different era of this state. Bridges and hospitals and civic centers. Gerald Harmon was in a hospital bed in what used to be the study. He was small under the blankets. His hands on the coverlet looked like something carved from old wood. But when he turned and looked at me, his eyes were the same as I remembered. Sharp. Direct. Weighing things. You look terrible, he said. So do you, I said. So do you, I said. He smiled slow and dry. Sit down, Raymond. We need to talk before I lose the thread. He told me he'd been watching Douglas for 2 years. Not specifically Douglas. He'd been watching a pattern of behavior in certain estate situations. Property quietly transferred. Heirs quietly displaced. He had a small team that tracked these things, originally because he'd been defrauded himself 20 years ago by a business partner. He'd recovered. He'd never forgotten what it felt like. I remember you, he said, because you were the only subcontractor in 30 years who came to me when you found a problem instead of covering it up. You reran 40 feet of conduit on your own dime because you found a junction that wasn't up to code, and you didn't ask me to pay for it. You said it was your work, and it was going to be right. He looked at his hands. I've thought about that a long time. You don't meet many people like that. He wanted to offer me a position. Not running a company, his company was being transitioned to a board, and that was already arranged. What he needed was someone to sit on a review committee overseeing the charitable foundation he was establishing. A foundation focused on housing and legal aid for seniors who had been displaced through estate fraud. He needed someone who couldn't be bought, he said. Someone who knew what it actually felt like to sleep on a motel room floor. The salary was $60,000 a year, for 5 years. After that, a seat on the board which came with its own compensation. I looked at Ivy. She was sitting very still. I looked back at Gerald. Why not just give the money directly to the foundation? I asked. Why do you need me? Because I need someone with standing, he said. Someone who can walk into a room with lawyers and judges and say, I have been exactly where this person is standing, and I am telling you what it does to a human being. That carries weight you can't manufacture." He paused to breathe, and the effort of it was visible. "Also," he said, "I need someone who would actually care. That's harder to find than you'd think." I asked him what he wanted in return. He said, "Make sure Douglas doesn't get away with it." I reached for the pen Janet was holding, and then Ivy's phone rang. She stepped into the hallway. I watched her through the doorway. I saw her face change. She came back in, and the color was gone from it. "It's Douglas," she said. "He filed an emergency petition this morning. He's claiming you're a vulnerable adult in need of a guardian. He's claiming I've been exploiting you." She swallowed. "There's a hearing tomorrow. He's asking the court to appoint him as your legal guardian." I set the pen down. Gerald looked at me. "Go," he said. "Sign those later. Take care of your daughter." I drove back to the motel, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I thought about what Douglas had just done. He hadn't just come after my money. He had looked at what I loved most, my daughter, my relationship with my daughter. The one thing that had kept me functional through 9 months of that motel room. And he had aimed at it. He thought that would break me. He didn't understand what 9 months on a motel room floor does to a man. It doesn't break you. It removes everything that wasn't load-bearing. I picked up the phone and I called the only other person in Douglas's world who might know where the bodies were buried. His former business partner, a man named Leonard, who Douglas had pushed out of their consulting firm 6 years ago in a dispute that had ended in a settlement agreement with a non-disclosure clause. Leonard had moved to Allentown and, as far as I knew, hadn't spoken to Douglas since. He picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting for this call," he said, "for 6 years. We met that night at a diner in Quakertown. Leonard was smaller than I remembered, grayer, but his eyes had the particular focus of a man who has been sitting on something a long time and is relieved to finally put it down. He brought a thumb drive. He told me that before the NDA was finalized, he had made copies, emails, financial transfers, communications between Douglas and the real estate attorney who specialized in helping families restructure estates when the primary heirs were, in Leonard's words, too grief-stricken to notice what was happening. He had documented at least 4 other families Douglas had done this to. Different names, different states. Same playbook. He picks people when they're down, Leonard said, wrapping both hands around his coffee mug. He picks people who trust him because of the relationship, and then he takes everything he can before anyone has the time to think clearly. I looked at the thumb drive on the table. It was smaller than my thumb. It felt heavier than it looked. I asked him why he'd never gone to the police himself. He looked out the window at the parking lot for a moment. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Because the NDA has teeth, and I had a daughter in college, and I didn't want the legal fight." He looked back at me. "But you're already in the fight, so here." He slid the drive across the table. "Take it. Burn his world down." I picked it up and put it in my shirt pocket. The hearing was at 9 in the morning, in the Bucks County Courthouse. Janet Hale met us outside at 8:30. She had 2 associates with her and the expression of someone who had prepared for 3 times as long as the other side expected. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, the kind that feels like a reprimand just by being in it. Douglas sat at the plaintiff's table with an attorney I recognized from local news coverage of a real estate dispute a few years back. He was expensive-looking. He was the kind of lawyer you hire when you want to send a message about how serious you are. Douglas himself was wearing a dark suit and the face he used at funerals. He did not look at me when I walked in. His attorney laid it out in measured, practiced language. Raymond Kowalski, he said, was a 67-year-old man suffering from unresolved grief and depression following the death of his wife. He had allowed himself to be influenced by his adult daughter, who had taken on a caretaking role that had evolved into financial dependency. There were concerns about Mr. Kowalski's decision-making capacity. There were concerns about isolation. The family, meaning Douglas, simply wanted to ensure that proper oversight was in place. He said the word family 4 times in his opening. I counted. Douglas took the stand. He was very good. I will give him that. He spoke about the rain with genuine feeling, or something that looked exactly like it. He said he was worried about me. He said he had tried to reach out. He said Ivy was a lovely girl, but perhaps not equipped to make decisions of this magnitude. He said he only wanted what was best for all of us. The judge, a woman named the Honourable Cecilia Drummond, listened with the attentive patience of someone who had seen versions of this before. Then Janet stood up. She didn't start with the thumb drive. She started with the thumb drive. She started with the property deed. She walked Judge Drummond through the timeline. The property purchased by Lorraine under her maiden name, the management company records, the rent ledger, the transfers into Douglas's LLC. She introduced the bank statements. She introduced the affidavit Douglas had filed, claiming I was mentally incapacitated, signed, she pointed out, 11 days after Lorraine's funeral. 11 days. Douglas's attorney objected twice. Both times Judge Drummond waved it off with the particular patience of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the other side to finish talking. Then Janet introduced the thumb drive. She had already had the contents certified and printed. She walked through 3 of the other families, names redacted, but the financial structures identical. Same LLC pattern, same affidavit language, same sequence of events following a death in the family. She said, "Your Honor, this is not a concerned brother-in-law filing for guardianship out of worry. This is a pattern of predatory estate manipulation that the petitioner has carried out at least 4 times that we can document. My client is not a vulnerable adult. He is a victim, and the person asking this court to give him control over my client's affairs is the person who created the situation this court is now being asked to remedy." Douglas looked at his attorney. His attorney was looking at his notes with the expression of a man reassessing. Judge Drummond asked Douglas directly, "Mr. Douglas, are you currently in receipt of funds from an LLC that was formed after your sister's death and before her estate was formally probated?" Douglas said was formally probated. Douglas said he would like to consult with his counsel. Judge Drummond said that was his right and that she would note his response for the record. Then she denied the petition. She didn't just deny it. She referred the matter to the district attorney's office with a written recommendation. She ordered an immediate freeze on the LLC account. She ordered a forensic audit of all transactions since Lorraine's death. And she looked at Douglas over her reading glasses and said, in a voice that carried the particular weight of someone who is being restrained, "If these findings are substantiated, you should prepare yourself accordingly." Douglas was very still. I looked at him from across that courtroom. He was not the man who had sat at my kitchen table the morning after my wife's funeral and told me I was destitute. He was smaller than that man. He was the right size now. I didn't say anything to him. There was nothing to say. Ivy took my arm when we walked out, and I put my hand over hers, and we stood on the courthouse steps in November light that was thin and cold and absolutely beautiful. Leonard was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had come to watch. I hadn't asked him to. He nodded at me when we made eye contact. I nodded back. Some things don't require more than that. We went back to Gerald Harmon's house that afternoon. He was weaker than the day before. I could see it. But he was awake, and he was clear. I signed the papers. Janet witnessed. I took a copy and folded it into my jacket. Gerald looked at Ivy for a moment. "Your father," he said, "wired a building when he was 22 years old and did something right when it cost him money to do it. That is how I knew you would be fine." He paused. "Eventually." Ivy laughed. I don't think she laughed since before her mother got sick. It sounded different than I remembered. Older, but still hers. Gerald died 19 days later. Quietly, in the night. The way people who have said everything they needed to say are sometimes allowed to go. I attended the funeral and stood in the back with my hat in my hands. There were a great many important people in that room. I was not one of them, but I was the one he'd asked for, and I've carried that with me. The audit took 4 months. What they found was worse than what we'd expected, and also exactly what we'd expected, if that makes sense. Beyond Lorraine's rental income and the savings account, there were 2 life insurance policies, small ones, 100,000 each, that Douglas had redirected by filing a change of beneficiary form with a forged signature while Lorraine was in hospice. The investigators found the original signatures in the insurance company's files and compared them. The difference was measurable. The DA's office called it what it was. Douglas was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Not at home. He was at a breakfast meeting at a restaurant in New Hope, the kind of place where people who think they are important go to be seen. The officers were polite. They were quiet about it. He was walked out past the hostess stand in his good suit, and the whole table watched, and I'm told the room got very still. He faces multiple felony counts. The trial date is set. Leonard's NDA, his attorney argued, was unenforceable in the context of ongoing criminal fraud, and a judge agreed, which means Leonard can testify. He will. I'm not going to attend that trial, not because I don't care, but because I have done enough of that kind of watching. There is a building in Doylestown with 4 commercial tenants who pay their rent every month, and that income belongs to me and to Ivy's future, and that is enough. The foundation Gerald established opened its doors 6 months after his death. I work 3 days a week. I sit across from people who are in the same position I was in, 60, 65, 70 years old, alone, displaced, told by someone they trusted that there was nothing left. I tell them there is always something left. Sometimes there is literally something left, a policy, a property, a document someone hoped they would never find. And sometimes what's left is just the fact that they're still sitting across from me, and that is enough to start. Ivy got a position at a hospital in Bucks County. She bought a small house 15 minutes from the commercial property, and on Sunday mornings she comes over, and we drink coffee in the kitchen, and she reads the newspaper, and I do the crossword, and neither of us talks about the motel or the floor or the gas station dinners if we can help it. We both know what those months cost. We don't need to keep paying for them by talking about them. But I want to say one thing clearly, for anyone who is sitting somewhere right now and recognizing this story. The warning signs were there long before Douglas sat down at my kitchen table. They were there in the way he managed information. Who knew what and when? They were there in how quickly he moved after Lorraine was diagnosed, volunteering for things, inserting himself, becoming indispensable. Grief makes you grateful for anyone who steps forward. It also makes you blind to why they're stepping forward. I trusted blood. I trusted proximity. I trusted the performance of concern. None of those things are the same as trustworthiness. If someone is making decisions on your behalf during a crisis, signing things, managing things, handling things because you are too devastated to handle them yourself, you need someone else. Someone with no stake in the outcome to review what is being done. Not because your family is necessarily Douglas, but because mine was, and I didn't know it until I was counting change in a parking lot at 11 o'clock at night. Pay attention. Ask the questions that feel impolite. The impolite questions are almost always the ones that matter. I built my life with my hands. I know what a solid foundation looks like, and I know what a compromised one looks like, even when it's been covered over to look fine. What Douglas built didn't hold. It was never going to hold. It was load-bearing lies on a cracked slab, and eventually the structure tells you the truth, whether you want to hear it or not. He thought I was finished. He thought grief had made me soft all the way through. He forgot that I'd spent 40 years making sure things were built right when it would have been easier and cheaper to do them wrong. That doesn't leave you. Not at 67. Not when your daughter is sleeping in the bed because you gave her the only one. Not when you're on the floor of a motel room in Bucks County with your wife's garden beds 2 miles away being tended by someone else's hands. That doesn't leave you. It just waits. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened. Not just what Douglas did, but what made it possible. And the honest answer is that I made it possible, not by being weak, by being trusting in a way that I had never stopped to examine. I spent 40 years in the electrical trade. I know what happens when you assume a connection is good without testing it. You assume, you move on, and then one day the whole circuit fails, and you are standing in the dark wondering how you missed it. That's what I did with Douglas. I assumed the connection was sound because it was family. I never tested it. I never had a reason to until I did, and by then the damage was done. What I learned about Douglas, in the end, wasn't really about Douglas. It was about the way certain people understand a crisis. They see it the same way a contractor sees a job that's behind schedule. as an opportunity to cut corners while no one is paying close enough attention. Douglas looked at my grief and he saw distraction. He looked at Lorraine's death and he saw a window. That is not a failure of intelligence, that is a failure of character. And those two things are completely different problems, with completely different consequences. The consequences caught up with him, they always do, not because of any invisible force keeping score, but because actions that require sustained deception are structurally unsound. You have to keep building on top of the lie. You have to keep adding weight to something that was never built to hold it. Leonard had been sitting on that thumb drive for 6 years. Janet had been tracking the pattern for longer. The field diary in Joe Miller's attic didn't disappear just because Charles Douglas assumed it had. The things you do in the dark don't vanish. They wait. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story is this: the intelligence piece matters, not book intelligence, street intelligence. The kind that asks why someone is volunteering for something when they didn't used to volunteer for anything. The kind that notices when information is being managed instead of shared. I was not unintelligent. I was grieving, and grief narrows your field of vision down to what's directly in front of you, and Douglas knew that and used it. So pay attention when you are most inclined not to. That is exactly when it counts. The ethics piece matters too, and it's the part I think about most when I sit across from someone at the foundation who is where I was 2 years ago. Douglas had the ethics of a man who had decided that his own comfort justified any method of obtaining it. That's not a complicated philosophy. It's actually a very simple one, and it is everywhere. The antidote to it is not cynicism, it's clarity. You can love people and still require that they be accountable. You can extend trust and still verify. Those things are not in conflict. And then there is Ivy. My daughter slept in that motel bed for 9 months without complaint, worked double shifts, handed me cash every Friday with a steadiness that I still don't entirely know how to account for. That is what I mean when I talk about resilience. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet, daily, show-up-again kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. She didn't know the story was going to turn out the way it did. She just kept going anyway. Raymond kept going too. So can you?